Okay, last we met, we were talking about a good dead friend, Immanuel Kant, talking about his stuff. And now we turn to his views of the categories of understanding, and then his examination of the 12 a priori concepts, and then responses to Hume's criticism, skepticism rather, and then moving on through more of his epistemology to his metaphysics, and then as far as time permits. So, without further ado, Poor listen, don't keep them in your pocket too long, because I may not. Now, what Kant's trying to do is figure out how we can have what he calls synthetic a priori knowledge of the world. That's to say, how we can know things without, know things about the world essentially prior to experience. And here's how he tries to work that out. He claims that knowledge comes from a combination of what he calls sensibility. What is distinct from what we talk about in terms of something, having sensibility, in terms of like good fashion sense, etc. He means essentially the senses. So the category there is the senses bring us something, some stuff. The second is the understanding itself. And he claims that, in my badly drawn cartoon there, that our senses bring us objects. So, for example, if you're looking at something, you have the experiences, stuff appears in the mind, and then what happens, to use an analogy, it's kind of like having a manufacturing plant, or to use another example, kind of like one of those Play-Doh toys for like shaping Play-Doh. Mm-hmm. And the senses like bring in a glob of Play-Doh, and then the understanding kind of stamps it, shapes it into something. And so we get an object brought in there, like a lump of Play-Doh, then our understanding thinks about it. Now, if he claims we only had perception, then we'd only have spatially and temporally located sensations. We wouldn't have anything organized. So to use an analogy, you can imagine like paint just simply splattered on a canvas. It'd be like bright colors and so forth, but no order or structure. And then what the mind does is take the paint and would organize it. So in a way, the senses bring us like the paint globs, and then our understanding orders that or figures out that it's an image. Another analogy could be, they used to have, back in the 90s, these used to be kind of popular. They'd have the weird images, and you'd stare at them just right. You could see like the 3D picture, kind of like that. So like the blob there is like what's been stuck in your mind, and then you have to kind of use your understanding to sort it out. So what then is knowledge going to be? Well, as he sees it, it's kind of a team thing. Knowledge involves what is brought in by the sensibility, plus the processing of the understanding. And he claims that we do this ordering and organizing by concepts. And he claims these concepts are pure in the sense that they're a priori. They're not the result of experience. So we have these categories, and he thinks that these are the final word in the matter, because he's based it on Aristotles Logic, which he also believed was the final word in logic, which he was totally wrong about, but that's what he believed. So what are his famous 12 a priori concepts? And what do they do? Well, he believed you could order and organize any experience you have using these 12 concepts. So to use an analogy, you can kind of think of them as like a filing cabinet with folders designed alphabetically. And the idea is that no matter what form comes into your office, you have a place to stick that form in the filing system. And so you can think of them as kind of like a filing system in which anything that comes in can get filed, or so we hoped. So what are these 12 concepts? Now, and again, he thinks these are exhaustive. Anything you've got can fit into these. Going back to the analogy of the filing cabinet, that is the super bureaucrat who says, my filing cabinet can file anything. No matter what you bring me, I've got a folder for that. So, here's how they break down. There are three sort of main categories, and each one, in turn, has its own three things as well. So that's why they're 12. The first is quantity. And he claims the concepts here, falling under quantity, are unity, which is of course oneness, plurality, which is of course manyness, and totality, which is of course allness. So he thinks that that takes care of it. You have unity, which is oneness, plurality, which is manyness, and totality is allness. Now one question might be, so why would he think this would cover everything? Well, the tie to Aristotle's logic is kind of important here. If you've had logic or critical thinking, or if you're just a big fan of Aristotle and learned about this categorical logic, in the categorical logic, there's only 4 sentence types. There's all S or P, all subjects or predicates, no subjects or predicates, some subjects are predicates, and some subjects are not predicates. So really you've got all, no, some are not. And even though it seems pretty limited, you can actually say a lot with just those 4 sentence types. And modeling that on Aristotle, he thinks you can do the same sort of thing with these concepts, that anything you get, you can stuff into one of those categories. And we can try this. For example, political candidates running for office. Well, we look at it in terms of quantity. So do we have a unity there? Or a plurality?
Repeat the question.
Oh, suppose let's try to use this category. So let's take the battle for the presidency, the candidates that are still running. Do we have a unity of candidates, or do we have a plurality of candidates? Yeah. And if we gave the list of them, all ones that are running, we'd have the totality. So I guess in a way it does kind of work, because you've got, like, crudely put, 1, not 1, well, 1, more than 1, everything. So in a way, yeah, because it's either you've got 1, more than 1, less than all, or all. So, yeah. Now, of course, one thing that people often point out with categorical logic, and this is, well, what about even finer divisions? Well, he would say you could presumably put the finer divisions in there as well. Second set of concepts, quality. And he claims that here would be reality, negation, and limitation. And again, he claims that that covers everything, because these are exhaustive categories. Lastly, is this category of modality. Now, if you've ever done any computer programming, the use of modality here may sound kind of confusing, because in programming, a modal window is one, you've probably experienced these yourself, because they're super annoying. It's when you get a dialogue window in your screen, but you have to deal with it. You can't, like, no matter where you click, the damn thing still won't yield. It's like, I am not going to go away until you click my OK button or my not OK. Yeah, that's a modal window, which are the absolute worst things that should never just have those as a rule. I always hated them. But he doesn't mean that. He means something different. In his view, modality is dealing with possibility and necessity. So he's got, in this case, some pairs. Possibility paired with impossibility. Now, does that cover all the options? Well, is something either possible or impossible? Does that cover all the bases?
Yes.
Yeah, pretty much. Either it can be or it can't be, and that takes care of it. Second, the existence and non-existence. Does that cover it? If you take anything that you're talking about, does it either exist or not exist? Yeah. Although, I mean, I guess you could claim some things like half exist. Yeah, probably like in a horror movie or something. It only half exists. I mean, you could have like half a pizza, but what we really mean is you've got a whole, you know, what remains. Lastly, necessity and contingency. What something either must be or it merely could be. And again, Kant thinks this covers everything. This is what we use to organize and order all of experience. So is he right? Those get the job, get it done. Yeah, on the one hand, going back to Aristotles Logic, you could say, yeah, either you got some, none, or all. But then, of course, the criticism would be you might want finer distinctions. But Kant thinks he's got it done. Now, another big part of Kant's project is, where would hit that window over there? Looks like it did a lot of damage. Well, they're good windows because, you know, it didn't blow through them, so good to know. I'm guessing they're probably mowing. They probably scooped up a rock and fling it, because that'll do a lot of damage. That's why I don't like lawnmowers. They can chop off your parts and they can sling crap really fast. So I get a little push mower because they can do a lot of damage. Of course,
One without a motor?
yeah, it's like, although the pushing can do some damage. It was much easier to push it when I was younger. Now it seems like it's much heavier. You get one of those solar powered ones. It's really slow. Of course, they can still sling stuff and cut off parts. So, yeah, I guess I just get some goats, angry goats. Now, part of this project was to address Hume's skepticism. As someone looked at Hume, Hume ends up sort of in a frenzy. You can almost imagine him, if he hadn't sort of calmed down, being, you know, sedated for his own safety and the safety of others. And Hume ends up saying, we can't have any a priori knowledge about the world. And this ends up being a disaster for him because he ends up saying, well, all we've got, since we can't see the necessity, is unconnected impressions, just, you know, the bundles and, you know, all these perceptions. And nothing connects them all together. So Hume ends up, you know, in sort of a rabid skepticism. There is nothing that we know. Now, of course, what saved him from being, I guess, medicated and sedated and restrained was that he says eventually, of course, you just kind of calm down and you realize this is all just crazy talk, and you go and have a beer and don't worry about it. But when he goes back to think about it, he ends up back in the mouth of madness, a true disaster of epic proportions. And Kant wants to make the world safe for knowledge, so he's got to respond to Hume's problems. Now, one of the things that Hume was concerned about was substance. And Hume essentially lays out a skeptical argument for substance. Essentially, you go looking for it, you don't find it. And it's actually a pretty good argument, because if you take the classic view of substance, of something that supports properties, we can go with the usual example. We take this wall, for example, and we, you know, take away the color, the shape, the mass, the density. If I had like metaphysical, you know, claws, I could peel all that stuff away. We'd be left with, it would seem, nothing. If there is no color, shape, size, or mass, we'd say we get a whole lot of nothing. And so also with the substance, the material substance, Hume says you're looking around, you just find perceptions, there's no material substance, and so everything just seems to be, you know, just splatters of paint on a canvas. Could you go back to my previous metaphor? So how does Kant save the day for substance? Well, when we encounter the world, assuming we're not on LSD, does the world seem to be, our sensations appear to be coherent, structured, and ordered? Do we seem to encounter like consistent objects? Yeah, I mean your laptop or your phone or your soda, they don't do, you know, again, when it's not on LSD or other, you know, other drugs, everything seems pretty consistent. And we see things as being grouped. And so Kant says, we do experience, these objects. And so, how's he going to make that happen? Well, he says there is a logical category of substance. Now, it differs from our good dead friends Descartes and Locke in the following way. Descartes and Locke believed that substance was an underlying metaphysical thing, stuff. Descartes talked about physical substance, mental substance, and Locke reluctantly did too. Locke was like, this stuff is really weird, but, only game in town. So what does Kant do? Well, he doesn't want to accept the weird metaphysical reality, for a good reason. Going back to that argument, if you peel away all the properties, you would seem you're left with nothing. So, he's not going to say there's this underlying metaphysical stuff. What he's going to do is this. He says, what we do is we don't have substance out there supporting properties. What we're doing is having it as a logical category that we use to order the world. In other words, to use, I guess, a rough example, when you look at this room, we organize it into desks, tables, chairs, cups, windows, etc. And Kant would say there's no underlying metaphysical substance. We have no way of knowing about that, but we have substance as a category, as independent, objects. To use, kind of a rough metaphor, whatever it is that's out there, we'll get to like what it might be, we have sensory experiences of, and then it gets in there. And then what we do is we organize that experience, and we organize it in terms of substances, in terms of objects. Now, is he right? Well, one interesting thing that happened that actually provides a pretty useful basis for answering that question, as I mentioned before, there is doctors and scientists who had people who were blind from birth, gave them sight, did surgery, etc., and they could see. And part of it was, I guess, being nice, helping people who were blind, but also part of it was for scientific research. Testing these theories. If someone never saw it before, how would that work? Because we're dealing with babies. Unfortunately, babies aren't really good at questions. Little baby, are you experiencing metaphysical substance? Just keep pooping in their diapers. They're useless. Useless. And of course, by the time you can answer questions like that, you've forgotten how that all worked. So someone who's blind who gets sight, then you can ask them, because they're adults, they have words, etc., and you can say what's going on. And what they found is, when someone, say, first sees a cow, and they ask them to sort of delineate the objects, what they'll do is they'll draw, they'll see a cow, for example. Imagine you get like one of those, cows with the big patches of, color. And they'll consider each color patch to be a separate object. So they won't get that it's one single entity, the cow. They'll divide it up basically by color patches, the white patch is one thing, the brown patch another, and all the other patches are other stuff. Which seems weird to us, but when you think about it, it does kind of make sense. Unless you have a concept of cow, you're not going to know how that divides up. And you can do a similar thing with, if you just look outside, we divide up, we separate the tree from the ground, the wall from the ground, the sidewalk from the ground, the people walking from the ground, the sky from the ground, the buildings from the ground. But if we didn't have those concepts, it would all look kind of like one thing. We think those things are all separate, but those are because of our category of substance. So you could say that Kant was right, that we do divvy up the world based on this concept, that substance isn't out there, it's in our mind. Or so it goes. So he thinks he saved the world of substance. Now, a critic might point out, but Kant, can we be wrong about this? And Kant would say, yes. our organization could be off. We could get it wrong, like which things are parts of other things. Like, I mean, you can imagine like if you have a tree with, like the tree out there, it's got the Spanish moss hanging on it. And if you don't know what Spanish moss is, you may think that Spanish moss is part of the tree. But actually, of course, it's a separate entity. It's a free-floating thing. It's actually not parasitical. It just kind of grows on it and hosts a wide variety of bugs. So don't want to walk through it because bugs. Actually, everything in Florida hosts a wide variety of bugs, most of which you don't want touching you. Actually, as a general rule, if it's a bug, you probably don't want it touching you. I think that's a good, consistent category of the understanding. Now, the second thing he tries to save is causation. Now, we saw Hume's analysis ends up essentially presenting a psychological account. You experience something, experience it again, and again, one thing followed by another, and eventually you become habituated until you have the habit of, okay, I put my microwave I put my popcorn in the microwave, set it for a minute and a half, and then popcorn appears. So I become habituated, do that over and over again, and I think next time I put it in, I'm going to get that popcorn. Now, given Hume's view, there is no necessary connection. So you can never know that your microwave will heat your popcorn. You can never know that fire will burn. All you can say is, all my previous experiences with fire, and putting my hand in it, has followed, hand in fire followed by pain. But given Hume's theory, there's no way you can say there's a necessary connection. And Kant, of course, considered that a disaster because if Hume was right, in a way, science would be kind of impossible. You could just say, okay, we have these equations, but they really mean nothing. All we said is that every other time, if you have a certain mass and density, you get this, or certain mass and volume, you get this density. What happens next? Who knows? You have to test it. You have to try it. Maybe it'll be totally different. Maybe density will be mass times, number of squirrels in the area. Who knows? But Kant, of course, was aware that would be a disaster for science. You got to have that necessity. So, what Kant does is this. He thinks it's essential to have a notion of causation to distinguish between what he calls contingent a posteriori truths and synthetic a priori truths. Namely, he wants to distinguish between things that just happen to be and things in which there is actually a causal connection, that one thing must cause another. So, for example, if a squirrel runs by and the light suddenly goes out, given Kant's view, we could say, well, if we saw that happen a lot, we have to say squirrels cause lights to go out. But we would tend to think that there's no connection. Then the question would be is how could we ever justly say there really is no connection? Or how do we justify our laws of physics and chemistry and biology? And Kant says, you gotta accept cause and effect. But he agrees with Hume. No matter how you look, you never see cause and effect. You just see one thing followed by another. So, what he thinks we do is this. Experience reveals the particular cause and effect relationships. Now, we can be wrong about this, because we never actually see cause and effect. But he says, the mind always organizes the world in terms of cause and effect. We try to organize that. Now, Kant would think, presumably, that we can sort it out. I mean, you take the example of classic causal fallacies, like post hoc, after this, therefore because of this. And what we do is, empirically, we can never see what the real cause is. We don't see the cause, but we can conduct experiments, presumably, and come to the conclusion that there's actually a causal connection. So applying heat to water to boil. And Kant thinks somehow we're able to use that to justify these synthetic a priori claims, or so he claims. Why so? Well, he claims that causation is not out there in the world, because again, as Hume argued, we never see it. But he claims it is a genuine distinction in experience. So in an odd kind of way, cause and effect is in your mind, but it's a real thing in your mind. With my bad drawing, like we observe stuff, like maybe potato going to baked potato. And then what we do is we have that experience and our mind orders it with cause and effect. Now, of course, then there is the question of, still the practical question of, well, how do we distinguish between real cause and effect and just coincidence? And that's, a bit of a challenge. But Kant thinks he's established, made the world safe for causation by putting it in our minds. So is he right? Do we have to see the world in terms of cause and effect? Yeah. And to be fair to Kant, we are able to, through the sciencey stuff, we're able to sort things out. I mean, a good example of this, Kant doesn't bring this up, but a good example is what's called the intentional fallacy. The idea being that is to attribute to things that happen an intent, the person meant to do that. And apparently, at least according to people who are experts on kids, kids have this view. They think everything that people do is intentional. So if they say, well, why did the person fall down? Well, he must have wanted to. Or why did he sneeze? He must have wanted to. But then we learn to separate out things that are intentional from things that are just happen, like falling or sneezing. And we never actually see, like, the difference, so to speak, but we sort things out. So maybe, Kant's right. We're able to somehow sort it out. Or maybe we're just deluding ourselves. But probably not. Now, this does lead to sort of a general problem, the subjective-objective problem. You normally think of the subjective as it's all in your head, and objective is it's out there. Now, for Kant, the problem is that he does, and as we'll see more in a bit, he does claim there's like stuff out there, but we never directly experience the stuff out there. So then the challenge is, if the objects of our knowledge are in our mind, how can we talk about them, there being objective knowledge? Well, here's how he works it out. In a way, it's kind of like Berkeley's, the problem Berkeley. Berkeley said, everything is perceptions. So then the question is, how do you tell hallucination from, real stuff? And his claim was, well, vividness. And then, of course, people, I guess he never really had any vivid hallucinations. And Kant runs into a similar problem. How do you tell what's just in your mind from what's subjective? And here's how Kant works it out. Subjective experiences lack consistency, and they're not interpersonal. Take, for example, hallucination. If this hallucination, how do you tell if something's hallucination or not?
They're saying they see something that you don't see.
Yeah, and how do you tell, if someone's seeing stuff you don't see, you probably think, possibly hallucinating. And if you're seeing stuff no one else is seeing, either they're messing with you, or you're hallucinating.
It's like that picture of the dress.
Oh, yeah.
Gold and white and blue and black.
Yeah, everyone is hallucinating. There was no dress. That's the secret. There actually is no dress. Yeah, they blew up the internet for a while. Then people just totally forgot about it. They moved on to other things. Of course, the philosophers just say there is no color. It's all in the mind. So whatever you see is what it is. Problem solved. Thank you, Kant. Yeah, so actually that would present an interesting problem for Kant, because if people do see, the dress is a good example, people do see the dress in different colors, they would say, well, it's inconsistent, so would that not be like a subjective experience? But then if we say that all color is subjective, then we end up with a bit of a problem. But, Kant's distinction is that. If it's something consistent and not, and interpersonal, objective. If not, then subjective. Now, of course, then you end up with some problems. What if you have people who are all, say, crazy in the same way? For example, there's a sci-fi story about, actually there's several like this, where it's about like a, kind of an alternative, future where everybody's crazy. Everyone has a mental illness. And so they all see the world, like all the paranoids see the world paranoid, exactly the same way. So they're consistent and it's all interpersonal, but we still say that the conspiracy is all in their heads. So it does create that interesting, problem. I mean, one way to look at it would be, well, if everybody's paranoid, then it is real. Because that's what it is. It's interpersonal and consistent. In a world where everyone's paranoid, that's the reality. Kant then turns to his theory of experience. Now, for him, there is what he calls the manifold of experience. Not the ancient part, but the variety. So we have a huge variety of sensory impressions. Now, like Hume, he accepts that these experiences are distinct and disconnected. Going back to the metaphor I started using, you can think of it as like paint splatters on a canvas. All the bright colors there, disorganized, etc. Or a metaphor I used earlier. Back in the 90s, they had those pictures that were all the rage. You'd stare at them. If you stared just right, you'd see like a three-dimensional, image. They used to have those in malls, back when there were malls. So I guess they were about the same time. Now, what he claims is that the unity we experience is not out there in the world. He thinks, Hume was right. There is no unity of experience in the world. The unity lies in the mind. Like again, going with the example of that, staring at that image, the mind orders that. Or to use another example, when you look at like pattern, look on the tiles. There's no intentional images here. Unfortunately, there's no good example. It all just looks like stew or something. But sometimes you'll do like a watermark or something. It'll look like something. You're looking at it. Or clouds. Another good example is clouds. If you look at the cloud, like what does it look like? And of course, the cloud just looks like a fluffy cloud. It's the mind that puts that impression on it. So you could say that Kant seems to be right. That if we look at the world sort of analogous to clouds or markings on tiles or water spots, there's no actual order out there in that sense, but we put the order there. You can imagine, so in a sense, the same thing we do with clouds, we're always doing everything. What does that object look like? Well, it looks like a desk. Oh, you're right. It does look like a desk. I think it looks like a bunny rabbit. That's a weird bunny. So how do we do this? Well, he thinks we get a whole bunch of stuff going on in our mind. And of course, being Kant, he likes to organize the organization of experience. And he says there are three types of synthesis. First one is this. He calls it the synthesis of apprehension and intuition. And even though he has like a complex name for it, the idea is pretty straightforward. This involves our capacity to distinguish elements of experience from other elements and take them as one experience. To use a concrete example, imagine you're at a club, it's very loud. Of course, there are people talking, there's all kinds of other sounds, but there's music playing. And what you're able to do, this particular synthesis would be pulling a note out of all that noise. So you're able to essentially process all the sounds that are going and pull out that note. And for him, that would be what he calls synthesis of apprehension and intuition. So literally we are apprehending, in this example, the note. So can we do that? Can we filter out particular sounds? Yeah. And we're actually pretty good. So you ever try to talk in a club? It's doable to a certain point. Second synthesis is what he calls synthesis of reproduction in imagination. Now, this involves remembering the elements of an experience by using the imagination in order the experience. Going with the music example, to identify something as the second note, we must remember there was a first note. And it's interesting that he takes memory and imagination to be, essentially imagination to be memory. But in a way it does make sense, because in a way you are, I guess, imagining what was. And if you imagine right, I guess that's correct memory. And if you imagine wrong, I guess it would be not memory, but imagination. So I guess maybe memory is just imagination that gets it right. Yeah, so to remember that there was a first note is necessary for saying correctly there is a second note. The third and final is what he calls synthesis of recognition in a concept, namely regarding experience a unified whole and grasping this by means of a concept. So going with our song example, it would be going through the steps. You're at a club, you say, wait, I think I like this song. You extract out the note from all the surrounding noise, then you're remembering the notes, all the notes of the song, by remembering the past ones and recognizing which ones, and then you're able to essentially recognize the entire song through that process. So hear the note, wait, I hear that note, could be the song I like, and then you recognize it's that song, the song you like. Which could be, many songs. So those are that's his theory of experience and part of how it works. So he's right about that. Can we do that stuff? Mm-hmm. I guess Kant did a lot of clubbing, because he knows how to do that, how to do the things. Actually, I don't think Kant would have done a lot of clubbing. Now, in terms of the concepts, he thinks that we get the empirical concepts through experience. But he thinks in order to get the empirical concepts, they require, as a necessary condition, the a priori concepts. Going back to these, plurality, totality, reality, etc. And what the mind does, in case you wonder what the badly drawn thing here is, the mind essentially does that synthesis. Of course, to synthesize is to, manufacture or create. And so what he thinks happens is we have experience. So going back to the analogy using before, imagine the mind is like one of those Play-Doh toys, where Play-Doh comes in, you can mold it or like squeeze it through the, making round Play-Doh or square Play-Doh or whatever. Or you can think of like at the beach, using the sand molds, or Jello molds, because there's always room for Jello. Wonders of Jello. Well, it's like that can't be true, because eventually you would fill up unless Jello has some sort of magical property, which it might. It might have that magical property. No matter how much you put in, there's always room for more Jello. So essentially, you can think of it like a glob of Play-Doh plops in the mind, or a handful of Jello flops into your head. Wow. And then you can think of these concepts, the a priori concepts, are like badly drawn here, like the mold. It comes down and like Jello molds it. And so you have all these, you take the example like this room, you have all like the colors and crap is just flying into the mind through the senses, and we order and organize it. And we can also go to the example that he gives of the song. Like when you, sometimes if you hear like kind of like noise, it's happened to me, like you'll hear kind of noise, you're not sure, is that a song playing, or is that just noise? And you're trying to kind of organize it, figure out, okay, is that the song? And so you get the noise coming in your mind, and in a way you're trying to stamp it, so to speak, but it's not quite stamping. Or sometimes, of course, we stamp what really isn't there. Everyone's probably experienced, you kind of think you're hearing like a couple notes of a song, but then it turns out it's just the noise of like the washing machine or your car going by or something. So that's how he thinks it works. So roughly put, to use my metaphor, the experience brings in whatever, a big glob of Jello or Play-Doh, whatever metaphor you want, and then the concepts, stamp it, organize it, and that gives you the object of the understanding. Or to use an example of the song, noises just kind of pour into your head, and then your categories of, you say your understanding of notes, or organizes the noises into an experience of a song. You can also use a metaphor or example of language. If you don't speak a language, it's just noise pouring into your head because you don't have the concepts. But if you understand it, then you're able to stamp the sound, so to speak, and then you understand what's going on. So that's his theory of knowledge, and he thinks that he solves the human problems and has saved the day for Jello, for which there is always room for more. Before heading to his metaphysics of Jello, anything about the previous stuff that needs more stuff?
So, I guess, like, creating the concept of, like you said, synthesizing, like, okay, say if you're watching a television show and you turn the sound off, and you can, like, your mind will play, like, the song or the theme song when you think you hear it, but you don't hear it. Is that the same thing? Or?
It could be similar, because what you do is your mind would be putting something into the experience that's not being provided by that experience. Yeah, so it's a good metaphor. So just like the song isn't there, but your mind is supplying it, similarly, you have an experience of whatever, the mind is adding that something extra to it, adding it to what's not there to what is there. Or so he believes. I guess that'll be my next book, Kant and Jello. It'll be number one philosophy bestseller. It'll sell 3 copies. That's a bestseller in philosophy. Now, his metaphysics, as you might imagine, kind of strange, which shouldn't be a shock because everything's been strange so far, and why should that be different? Now, Kant has argued that synthetic a priori judgments are possible in math and physics. And again, his objective is basically to show that we can have a priori knowledge about the world. So we can be certain and have a foundation for our sciences, mathematics and physics. Because otherwise, if Hume was right, we're doomed, essentially. Except, beer will save us. I guess that's Hume's ultimate point. Now, Kant wonders if he can do the same thing in metaphysics. He wants to see, can we have knowledge of metaphysics? Now, for him, he takes metaphysics to, in a way, be literally metaphysics, what is beyond the physics. And Hume believed that metaphysics ended up, in disaster. We saw with his view of personal identity, he goes through all this stuff about bundles, and he's like, screw it, it's all just words, I'm gonna go have a beer. Now, Kant himself does sort of share Hume's skepticism, because here's the problem. Literally, metaphysics requires going beyond the realm of physics, beyond the realm of experience, or so he claims. And so he thinks that we cannot get knowledge about reality beyond our experience. Why? Well, basically it works like this. Kant thinks that the knowledge of our world is limited to what we can perceive in space and time, and what's known through the categories of understanding. So essentially I have 2 limits. One is the limit of experience itself, what's kind of flooding into the senses. And the second thing is the categories we have to process stuff. To use an analogy, it's going to the factory analogy. A factory can make whatever it can do with the raw materials it's getting using its construction techniques. So if you have a factory where you have molten, say, steel, and you have molds to make, say, chisels, your factory can make all, chisels. And if you're asked, can you make, hot dogs, they would say, no. Because all we've got coming in is steel and, we have chisel molds. And so in metaphysics, there are two problems would be, one is, according to Kant at least, nothing metaphysical pours into the mind. And secondly, we don't have any categories for the metaphysics. So when I go to the factory, again, asking, can you make us unicorns? And they would say, well, we have no unicorn meat from which to manufacture unicorns, and we have no unicorn, manufacturing capabilities. So he calls metaphysics transcendent illusions. Now, of course, Kant kind of messes with those illusions himself. And this is what he does. He famously divides things into the phenomena and the noumena. It's kind of a cool word. Now, traditional metaphysics accepted the view, we saw this in Descartes and Locke, there's a distinction between our ideas of the world and reality itself. Descartes said, I can have all the ideas I do, but it could just be the evil demon, messing with me. Now the problem with that, of course, is we end up with the problem of the external world. If we accept we get ideas and there's stuff out there, but they're not the same, there's the eternal question of the matrix. What is real? Now Kant, in a way, solves this problem. The only world that can make sense is the world of objects appearing in experience. So the phenomenal world, the world of phenomena, is things as they appear to us. And for Kant, the phenomenal world is the real world. And the idea that it corresponds to an external reality is unintelligible. It's not stuff out there, it's stuff in here. For him, it's, to use going back to my analogy of the unicorn factory, you have stuff going in and the mind shapes it, so the world is that. It's that product. So if you had a factory that made chisels and you asked them, is there steel and chisel molds? The answer is, of course, why yes, because we couldn't have chisels without the steel or the molds. Now, what are some problems? Well, one problem is this. Like traditional metaphysicians, Kant does retain the notion of a world beyond experience. And he has to do this in part because of the following. He claims we don't actually create our experiences. What we do is we give them specific forms. Going back to my factory metaphor, the mind is a factory. And so we have, the concepts are like our molds, by which we shape things. But then experiences come in, however that is, however that works. The raw materials come pouring in. And so, Kant, in a way, is, noting we can't avoid talking about what lies beyond, like what's outside the factory. Now, what he calls this, he has the term noumena. What's that? Well, the phenomena is what we're experiencing. For example, this, right now, noumena. Phenomena. The noumena is supposed to be what lies behind the experience. The things in themselves unstructured by the mind's experience. Going back to the analogy, it's the splatters on the canvas before, that's out there. It's whatever it is that's out there before we experience it. Now, can we give any description of the noumena? Well, in a way, all we can say is it's what's out there and it is what is beyond our experience. It's the world as it is that we don't experience. Now, of course, it's a bit of a problem. Can we know the noumena? Well, it's kind of like, Berkeley's challenge. Can you perceive what you don't perceive? No. Because no matter how we try to figure out what the noumena is, we are experiencing it. And in fact, it creates an impossibility. You can't experience the unexperienced. Now, but maybe it could be argued that there may be a way of finding out what it is. Maybe if you could have different ways, as we'll see, Kant believes different beings are perceived the world differently. And so maybe if you could get like other ways of perceiving the world, instruments, etc., you may not be able to experience the unexperienced, but you may be able to somehow map out what is out there, which is the way what science tries to do. It tries to figure out what's out there really real for real. Now, he does end up with a bit of a mess. How so? Well, he does seem to suggest, imply, that the noumena somehow cause the phenomenon. But this is a problem. If we're able to apply causation to the noumena, then, well, we can't, given Kant's view. Why? Well, because given his view, we can only apply those concepts to experience, and we don't experience the noumena. So to say that the noumena cause the phenomena, given his theory, can't do it. So he ends up in a bit of a dilemma. If phenomena are caused by the noumena, then his whole epistemology just gets tossed, gets wrecked. If, however, the noumena don't cause the phenomena, then what's the point of the noumena? They don't do anything. So in a way, he ends up with his own kind of problem with the external world. All the challenges we saw from Berkeley. Namely, if you say there's matter out there, but we never experience it, I think it's there. And if you say that, it does, we somehow experience it, then we have to get rid of the theory that we don't experience matter. So, yeah, so you might say that in a way Kant didn't solve the problem, he just gave, some cooler names to stuff, which I guess could be in advance. So, he ends up with that problem. So, because when we talk about metaphysics and the noumena, we endeavor to go beyond our experience, but given his epistemology, that's impossible. So either way, it doesn't work. So, big problem. Now Kant, though, does try to work his way out of it. So, what does he try to do? Well, another thing he's famous for, in addition to his spoken word album, of course, is the transcendent illusions of metaphysics. And to make this possible, he brings in a third faculty. So we have the senses, we have the understanding, and third, we have reason, namely logic. The use of reason to order and unify the products of understanding. Now he thinks that pure reason generates its own concepts, which reference what transcends all experience. And he lays forth what he calls transcendental ideas. And sort of his reasoning is that these are beyond experience. We don't actually experience these, but they're so awesomely seductive, we just gotta, accept them. They're too cool not to believe it. And these are the self, the cosmos, and not the TV show, the thing, and God. Now there's a bit of a problem here. He claims reason mistakenly applies its concepts beyond their legitimate borders, the realm of phenomena. And our knowledge is actually limited to the realm of experience. So what happens is, pure reason tries to take us beyond the borders of experience into whatever that realm is, and tries to reason about the noumena. Now the problem is, of course, this results in paradoxes and illusions. To use an analogy, it's kind of like, that'd be like in a science fiction story, where people are trying to get beyond reality, and you know that's going to end badly, because it always does. And so reason tries to take us beyond our the experience world to the world of the noumena, but he thinks that it just doesn't work there. It's beyond our experience. Or to use another analogy, back in the 90s, there was a show called Deep Space Nine, a Star Trek show. And there were these wormhole aliens, and they existed at a level beyond human understanding. But of course, people would go in wormhole and run into them, but they were beyond comprehension. And so in a way, you can kind of use that as an analogy. It's like trying to deal with a reality that we claim exists, but it's beyond our ability to perceive or understand. Which itself is something we can understand because we make TV shows about that thing. So what are these transcendent illusions? Well, the first is the self. Now, we have a notion, people like Descartes and Locke and others, have a notion there is a self, a soul, an enduring non-physical substance. And the idea, as we saw in Descartes, is that ideas, feelings, beliefs don't just drift around, they exist within the mind. It's the same sort of argument that's used for physical substance. We encounter, say, hats with shapes and colors. We don't find just like hat drifting around. We find hat, but not hat drifting around on its own. Likewise, we have beliefs and thoughts, but we don't just see them floating around. You don't just see a thought, like a thought bubble just kind of drifting through the classroom and bumping into the ceiling. So we need in Kant's term, the synthesizing activity of the self to unify our experiences. So what's the problem? Well, the problem according to Kant is this. He agrees with Hume. If you go and poke around in your own mind, you never find the self. You just find a perception here, a perception there, a perception everywhere. So we have experiences, but we never experience having experiences. But, he argues, contends, the self is a necessary condition for the existence of experience. Now, his solution is this. He divides the self into two types, the empirical self and the transcendent, or transcendental self. Here's how this works. The empirical self is essentially what we know through introspection. We go and poke around in there, that's what we find. And he thinks that Descartes was onto something but made a basic mistake. Descartes thought he could go in and poke around and experience himself as a substance. But Kant says substance is a category for organizing experience. It is not applicable to what lies behind the experience. So he claims that Descartes discovered in his journeys into his mind was the empirical self, which you find by introspection. So, to see your empirical self, just close your eyes, and look around inside there. So, that's it. Now, but what we want to believe in is the transcendental self, the transcendental ego, the transcendental unity of a perception. Now, Kant thinks that we can reason our way into accepting it. How so? Well, here's how it goes. We must think of our experiences as if they're related to unifying principle. In other words, there's something that connects them together. And he thinks the source of this principle cannot be in space or time and cannot be conceptualized through the categories of understanding. So, the self is the subject of all our experiences. I'm experiencing this. But we can't know it through introspection or through science. So the self is noumena, what lies beyond experience. It is experiencing, but it is not itself experienced. That's answering the classic Jimi Hendrix question, are you experienced? And the answer is the self is experienced, but itself is not experienced. Which is a follow-up song that was never completed. which is a lot. Or maybe not, who knows. And of course, the purple haze is the noumena in this metaphor, or what lies beyond the purple haze. Now, what about the science self? Well, what Kant's trying to do here is to have the noumenal cake and eat it too. Here's how it works. We have no proof, of course, really of the noumenal self. But essentially Kant says, we really kind of need it, so okay. Now what about the self of psychology? This is what he says. When we introspect, we find psychological states. You know, like, I'm hungry, or I'm happy, or I'm sad, or I'm crazy, or I'm paranoid, or I'm psychotic, whatever you find in there. The self of science is not the transcendental self. It is the empirical self. Now, what Kant's doing here is, in a way, sort of doing his own version of the Cartesian compromise. Descartes, of course, wanted to make the world safe for freedom, morality, religion. Yet also make the world safe for science, mathematics, etc. And Kant's kind of working with a similar thing. How do we preserve the notion of the self, the metaphysical self, yet still do the science of psychology, and presumably today neurology and so forth? How do we do that? Well, one approach has been to say, well, you can't do that. You got to junk the old metaphysical self for good riddance. We'll focus on the purely empirical self, the self of science. Now, Kant does accept the empirical self. This would be the self of psychology, and today, neuroscience and neuropsychology. And he claims psychologists and neuroscientists can study people and find the law-like regularities regulating behavior. So the science studies the phenomena, but not the noumena. So we end up with a dualism. We can say things like, this is the way the brain works. This is what, biochemically, this is what depression is. Neurochemically, this is what thought is. This is what belief is. This is what love is. And Kant would say that's all good science. But then he also says, but there is a noumenal self that is not this. So you end up with, again, a very strange dualism. You have the self of science, which is deterministic, not metaphysical at all, just literally, presumably the brain. Then you have the noumenal self, which is something that's not this, something beyond science. So you might say, well, good job, Kant. We get our science, and we've got our religious, concepts as well. But then critics might say, well, if you got this, how does that connect to that? If we follow all these laws, how do we have this strange noumenal self? Which is a good question. And then you'd say, well, we really want this, so we gotta have it. Next time we'll pick up with the cosmos, and then on to God, and then ethics, and all questions shall be answered. So until next time,